This week we're going to start our discussion on motor learning theories. So what are the theories of how we motor learn, and then how might these help us in the clinic? So there are four motor learning theories that we're going to talk about. Adam's closed loop, historically the oldest theory. This was actually then adjusted by Schmidt. Schmidt took the best of some of Adam's ideas and applied them to what he called a schema theory. We will talk about ecological theory, which is very, very familiar to you because we've already talked about ecological theory for motor control, so you'll recognize this. And then the last theory is optimal theory, and optimal theory is actually a brand new theory. It just came out, and it's based on Gabriella Wulf's work, and she and Rebecca Lewthwaite at USC have put together this theory based on a lot of the evidence that they found around motor learning, and in addition, a lot of Gabriella Wulf's work. One of the first very well applied theories as far as motor learning would be Adam's closed loop theory. And Adam's closed loop theory has two types of memory or traces. So it leaves two types of traces in our memory. The first is called a memory trace, and that is the trace that you use to select and initiate the movement. The second trace is called a perceptual trace, and that actually detects error and then will take over the movement to improve it. So the perceptual trace actually will become stronger and stronger with the movement. So if you look at the image on the right, we're going to start where it says movement plan, and that the first time you use it, it's a movement plan. So the memory trace pulls up this movement plan and you initiate it. And then as you're moving, you get sensory input in response to that movement. That sensory input is then compared to the perceptual trace that you've formed, and then that perceptual trace takes over and then does movement adjustment as you're going around in the circle. And then you keep going around and around as the movement is going on. If we apply Adam's closed loop theory then to the clinic, some clinical implications. Well, practice is going to increase the strength of that perceptual trace. That trace that you compare your movement to and the sensory input that you're getting, and then you use to update the movement. So with more repetitions, the accuracy of the movement would actually improve, and it would improve in relation to the strength of the perceptual trace. So more repetitions, your perceptual trace gets stronger, therefore it produces more and more accurate movement. Some limitations. Movement actually can occur a lot of times and we don't get sensory input back, or we don't get good sensory input back. Sensory input and pulling it back and then comparing it to the perceptual trace and then improving the movement, that would actually take time. And so that would only be able to occur with movements that happen slowly. Movements that happen very rapidly before we can get sensory input back and analyze it, then this perceptual trace wouldn't really help us, and how would it explain us getting better? If the perceptual trace is used for then slow movements, then at some point, theoretically, the perceptual trace would get so strong and it would be able to account for our movements so well, our movements would be error-free. And that doesn't always happen. So that would be an issue. And if you think about having to store a movement trace and a perceptual trace, that would mean for every single movement we do, we would have to be storing two traces. And that eventually would lead to a storage issue. What we also know is variability and error actually improve our motor performance a lot of times. So then how would that help with the perceptual trace? Because if you make an error, that actually could damage a perceptual trace or cause a problem. It certainly wouldn't improve the perceptual trace. So in that case, Adams' closed loop theory really doesn't work. So again, the biggest issues with the closed loop are, first of all, movements, a lot of our movements, many of our movements, most of our movements happen so rapidly, we don't actually get good feedback, sensory feedback, while the movement's happening. We get it afterwards, but not while the movement's happening. So that's an issue. Second big issue has to do with this air. Air helps us. We know that based on the literature. So in this case, that perceptual trace would be either breaking down or definitely not improving. So that perceptual trace is going to be an issue for us with air. So Schmidt saw Adams' closed loop theory and sort of thought about this a little bit. He understood the limitations in this theory, but he thought there were some good things in this theory. So what he did was he liked this idea of a loop, but instead of a closed loop, Schmidt opened the loop. And what he did when he opened the loop is he left the idea so that you are building up something, and he called this a motor program, but he left it open because then you could apply it to the next time you used it. So this accounted for the fact that movements were happening very rapidly, and we wouldn't necessarily get the sensory input to update this movement. But he said, listen, we made a permanent change in these traces, and we would update the next time we move. So Schmidt opened up the loop. The second thing is he really liked this idea of two memories. He thought this is probably something that is likely happening. So he said there's, again, one program to set the movement in motion, and then another one to correct the motion. And he used these and built on this idea of a motor program. He also termed the coins recall schema and recognition schema. So he called them schemas because schema is more of an abstract memory or representation that we can use and apply in multiple events and for multiple actions. So instead of it being one plan for one thing that we do, Schmidt said, no, these are going to be generalized movement patterns that we're going to use for a lot of different events and for a lot of different skilled actions. So Schmidt, again, opened up the loop so that we could apply this schema to multiple activities that happen very, very quickly. And so we update the schema, and then we hold it, and we use it for the next time we activate that motion. So Schmidt suggested that in our short-term memory, we get information about the initial conditions, the parameters that need to be used, and the outcome and the sensory consequences. And we take that information and then we pull up a schema, a recall schema, and we select the response from a rule that we've created earlier. So we take this initial information, which we're not going to store long-term, we don't need it. But we code it into this recall schema, and then we select a response based on the rule that we've created from previous repetitions or previous experience with doing this skill. We do the skill, and then a recognition schema evaluates the sensory consequences that are important for this activity and tells us if we were successful or not. If we weren't, then we update our recall schema so it adapts to this last experience that we had. So in this way, it's this sort of updating this recall schema, then having a recognition schema that sort of identifies if we were successful or not, and then if not, we update the schema. And the things that we have to recognize every time we do an activity from this short-term memory is initial conditions, the parameters that are used, the outcome, and the sensory consequences. And we just use this information to update our schemas, but it's not stored long-term. So Schmidt's open loop theory now sort of improves upon what Adams did. So now it allows for improvement in the schema based on variability of practice. So the more variable the practice you have, the better you sort of set this schema that you use to update what you're doing. So that recall schema is improved upon, and then it also accounts for how air improves that schema for the next time that you activate that program. It also accounts for slow and rapid movements, so you can improve upon and activate the recall schema, whether it's a slow movement or a fast movement. And then the recognition schema looks at how well you did and then updates the recall schema. It accounts for the ability to perform novel movements as well, because if you have a schema that might fit, you could be very, very successful with novel movements, particularly if that novel movement falls within your schema. Maybe you've done something that is, the range of your experiences, and the novel thing falls within there. Error detection is accounted for after rapid movements. And Schmidt actually says after slow movements, maybe you don't need it because you had the ability to update it. And so maybe it's not as needed for slow movements as it is for rapid movements. So in this way, Schmidt took the best of Adam's theory and he used it to apply and to account for limitations in Adam's theory. So if we think about clinical limitations with this theory, so if we think about providing variable practice is great in kids, that it really helps them out a lot. So we're seeing a strong relationship between variable practice and children. Adults, not as clear cut, and the literature results aren't as clear. So if you provide variable practice for adults, sometimes it's very helpful, sometimes it's not. This may have to do with the fact that adults already have a lot of variable practice, so that providing them with additional variability in practice may not be as helpful to them, whereas kids tend to have more of a clean slate, and so providing variable practice to them seems to always be very helpful. The other limitation of this theory is Schmidt doesn't explain a lot about how motor programs or schemas are created and maybe what's in them. And it probably differs task to task. And again, if you have a novel skill and you've never done anything like it, then this theory is a little bit limited, because it doesn't tell you how sometimes people with little or no practice and little or no experience with anything like what they're doing seem to be able to coordinate the skills. So again, a little bit of a limitation there. The third theory of motor learning that we're going to talk about is ecological theory. And this was actually sort of first put forward by Carl Newell. And it's really based on both systems and ecological motor control theories. And this idea about searching for strategies that are very helpful. So Carl Newell suggests that the motor learner, searches for optimal relationships between perception and then the motor activity that they're performing in a very specific environment. So again, that's sort of the systems theory. They're looking at the individual, the task, and the environment. The learner will use both feedback during the movement, so knowledge of performance, and feedback following the movement, knowledge of results, to search for this optimal motor output. And so motor learning is literally the task of finding the most appropriate motor response by mapping out very task-specific perceptions that are needed and that the learner needs to understand and read, and then finding the best action based on the demands of the task. So it's not really rule-based at all, as Schmidt sort of put forward, that it's really finding and reading the perceptual information, mapping it to the best action depending upon the environment. You improve motor learning by helping the learner understand the perceptual cues the motor cues and the need in the specific environment, understanding search strategies for the space, like, so what is the most important information here and how do I read that information and then respond to it. And you try to provide information to assist them in sort of searching the space and understanding how to use it, and demonstration is a big part of this. So clinical implications and then limitations when we're talking about ecological motor learning theory, or Carl Newell's theory. So clinical implications, variability, practice are very, very important. Variability helps us understand what perceptual cues we should be attending to and how to fit it to the motor, and then practice, obviously, different examples of perception and changes in perception help us. So again, understanding those important perceptual cues and then matching them to the appropriate motor output. An important thing for the learner to do is to distinguish between which are relevant perceptual cues and which perceptual cues don't make any difference to us and don't change what we do. So understanding what is important versus what's not important would be very applicable to this theory. And then understanding those relevant cues, and then how do I respond to it motorically. Limitations, it's a really new theory. Not a lot of research in the literature has been applied to the specifics of this theory. So we have limited research supporting it. The newest theory of motor learning comes to us from Wulf and Lewthwaite in 2016, and they call it optimal theory. And optimal stands for optimizing performance through intrinsic motivation and attention for the learner. So in this theory, we're really taking account of motivation. And two things that are important for motivation are autonomy. So I feel like I have the ability to make decisions. I'm autonomous. Also enhanced expectations. So I believe that what I'm doing is going to lead to a positive outcome. So motivation, very important. The second thing that impacts us is attention. So where is my attention? And she really has a lot of evidence to suggest that this external focus really improves your attention and helps you with motor learning. So these three things go into helping the individual focus on the task goals and decreasing focus on themselves. These two, decreased self-focus and an increased focus on task goals, improve motor performance, which therefore improves motor learning. The improvement in motor learning then improves our external focus, improves our enhanced expectancy, increases my autonomy, and then also improves motor performance and therefore leads to motor learning. So this cycle is very positive. She also has a cycle that is a negative cycle, and that negative cycle increases self-focus, which impacts, so if we think about attention, more of an internal focus, decreased enhanced expectancies, decrease in autonomy, which leads to an increase in self-focus, a decreased focus on the task goals, which decreases our motor performance and decreases motor learning. So that cycle would be a negative cycle. But the one that's pictured in the slide is actually the virtuous cycle. That's a cycle we want to support because it will improve motor learning. In this 2016 article, there are some key components that are laid down for optimal theories, and these help us predict how well the person will do. The first one is when temporally associated with skilled practice, conditions that enhance expectancies for positive outcomes actually trigger a dopaminergic response and therefore set the system up for motor performance. Enhance expectancies and autonomy, the ability to make decisions, support and efficient goal action coupling by readying the motor system for task execution. Autonomy support facilitates performance by enhancing your expectations. So I'm making a choice, I'm going to do better. This improves our expectations. An external focus of attention directs you to the task goal, and again enhances goal action coupling. An internal focus of attention impedes your performance by directing your attention to the self and therefore not the goal, away from the goal. Movement success resulting from an external focus then improves your expectations that you're going to be doing well. So you see positive performance and therefore improves your expectancy that you're going to be successful in motor learning. We continue with the key components. Number 7, enhance expectancies and improved autonomy actually facilitate motor learning by making dopaminergic or dopamine available to help with that memory consolidation and the neural pathway development. So again, it sort of relates back a little bit to neuronal Darwinism by developing these pathways. Number 8, challenge. And success in a challenge actually improves the dopaminergic response, and then that actually helps learning as well. Higher expectancies as you have more and more success facilitates efficiently switching from the default mode network to a motor network that's actually associated with motor movement skill learning. An external attentional focus facilitates also switching from that default mode to motor learning networks. An internal attention focus actually impedes switching from the default mode and then on to the motor networks that are associated with movement skill. And then anything generally, conditions that optimize performance are going to facilitate learning. So again, having some success actually supports this switch and these motor networks starting to build and to improve upon as we move forward. All right, so we've reviewed 4 major motor learning theories. Probably the ones that we rely upon most are Schmidt, ecological, and then this optimal theory, which is a brand new theory. That has a lot of evidence behind it, but again is a little bit more complicated, brand new, has been tested by Gabriella Wulf over her breadth of research, but since this theory has been formed, again, a hot topic, a lot of people are trying to apply it, but hasn't been applied as a theory, a total theory, a lot to this point, but I'm imagining in the future it will. So again, some theories that you can use to sort of think about how to improve learning or how learning may take place. Next week we're going to talk about stages and then some how to implement and distinguish between different types of training that we're using. And again, something that's going to be very helpful for us in the clinic.